Hey everybody, this is Kurt. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Magic and Total War Warhammer 3. I figured after reading a couple of blog entries on the Total War blog, that might be a good time to talk about some of the changes that they have planned for Warhammer 3, specifically in Magic. So it's something, if you don't play Total War Warhammer 1 and 2, you may not be aware of this if you just play the other historical Total War titles. But Magic plays a massive role in not just the Warhammer Fantasy Battles universe, but in Total War Warhammer. Most armies and factions have access to magic, and the ones that do rely on it fairly consistently to either buff their own units, to debuff their enemy units, or to provide direct damage or other effects to their forces on the battlefield. It's absolutely essential, for most factions, that you do have spellcasters in every army, and so being such a central component to the Total War Warhammer games, I'm very excited to read what they have to say for how Magic will stay the same, how it will change in this new version of the game. If it's anything like what we've seen with some of the videos and some of the faction reveals, I think we're in for a treat when it comes to Magic. So I'm not going to read the whole article. There's 2 of them here that I want to take a look at. I'm not going to read them in their entirety. If you'd like to do that, we'll link them in the video description below. But we're just going to pull out some details that I think are really essential. So the author, Ben Barrett, begins with these 3 bullet points, essentially describing how the Winds of Magic reserve pool will work. So essentially the default number is 50 reserves of magic for a specific army. Providing that this is in a region with blowing winds of magic, sort of like your default, like the winds of magic are present, you're not going to be moving up or down in your reserves. You're just going to stay static at 50 unless something special happens. But then if you move in that same army into a region where the winds of magic are calm, where there is no winds of magic coming in from the realms of chaos, it will reduce your reserves by 10 per turn. So let's say you were to move this army with 50 in the reserves into a region with calm winds of magic, you're now looking at 40, and then 30 on the subsequent turn, 20 on the subsequent turn after that. And it will continue the longer you remain in this region. If you're a demon faction army, which I'm presuming will be the 4 demon armies of the Chaos Gods, you got Nurgle, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, and Khorne. If you stay in this region, your reserves drop that low, you'll eventually start to receive debuffs. But the opposite is true at the other end of the scale too. So if you're a demon faction army and you're in a place with strong winds of magic, then you could expect some bonuses to your units. I'm really excited to see how that works. Are these strong debuffs? Are they strong buffs? And if they're not, will they become somewhat irrelevant? I certainly hope not, because these demon faction armies, they ought to be extremely dependent upon the winds of magic, just like they are in the lore. Knowing how seriously they've taken the lore, though, I think that that's probably a good assumption to make, that demons will be very much attached to how magic is functioning in a specific region. Finally, it talks about how you can develop, how you can add to your winds of magic reserve. So say you're in a region that has strong winds of magic, that gives you +5 to your reserves per turn. If you adopt the channeling stance, it'll increase it by a further 15 per turn. And if you have a hero that has the magic reserve skill, it'll give you a 20% gain whenever the reserves are increasing. So what they're saying here is, in this specific example, you can get 22 reserves on the following turn, and then eventually it'll cap out at 100 within the next few turns, if it finally stops moving, whatever that means. It makes me think that there will be some characters, maybe some armies or factions, that are permitted to exceed that 100 cap, but I'm not sure. 100 winds of magic, that's an awful lot of winds of magic. I really hope that you're able to exceed 100. Maybe I'm misreading this, but when you're looking at some of the interesting campaign builds from Total War Warhammer 2, there will be times when you could get nearly infinite winds of magic. And while that may not be perfectly balanced, like in a multiplayer situation, it is a lot of fun to play in the single-player campaign, especially when we're on harder difficulties. You often need to find, I don't want to call it an exploit, I think it's working as intended, but you want to find these sort of super-powered abilities so that you can balance the scales a little bit. And the AI in Total War is another matter, and we're not going to talk about that today. But that's something else that I hope is addressed in this. So that's a little bit about the winds of magic. Now, further down the page, there are some other things that they wanted to highlight, and this looks like it's the expounding upon an earlier point about the debuffs and the buffs that factions get when they have high winds of magic reserves and low winds of magic reserves. So the first point they're making is that all demon factions receive replenishment rate, leadership and physical resistant debuffs when at low reserves. Okay, so that sounds like a supercharged version of being in attrition. You have decreases to your replenishment, your leadership, physical resistance. So that seems pretty much on target for what I would expect, and I think that feels pretty lore friendly to me. So that's good. At high, the buffs are campaign movement range and so we get four specific buffs depending on which chaos god your faction serves. So for Tzeentch, you have the barrier recharge speed, Khorne, spell resistance, Nurgle, melee defense, and Slaanesh speed. So essentially, some of their defining traits are just exaggerated. That's very interesting. Okay, so another point that I found interesting was the Storm of Magic. So essentially, when you're in the Realm of Chaos, except for the Realm of Khorne, whenever you're fighting there, presuming you're not in a survival or quest battle, you'll be utilizing the rule set for Storm of Magic. So this seems kind of similar to what we were just talking about with certain buffs that come into play when your specific spell lore is in one of your spellcasters is in the Realm of Chaos experiencing the Storm of Magic. It also mentions here that during the battle, there's sort of like a cycle that goes on where certain lores come into ascendancy and they experience these greater buffs. But anyway, they below here they've outlined several of the lores and the buffs that they'll be getting. So in Lore of Beasts, all your units will become immune to psychology and gain charge bonuses. That's huge. That is an absolutely huge bonus. Lore of Life, all units gain perfect vigor. Again, that's a huge bonus. Oh, I forgot the spells here. The Cataclysm spell for Lore of Beasts is Mercues, Monstrous Regiment. The Strength of the Wild is imbued on one unit's weapon damage, armor piercing, melee attack, and physical resistance. Wow, okay. Cataclysm spell for the Lore of Life, Storm of Renewal. A tree sprouts from the ground as raw life energy flows across the battlefield, providing a huge regeneration aura. Wow, okay. So that seems like, in some ways, looking at both these Cataclysm spells, they're spells that I could totally see being present in the traditional spell lores. So I'm presuming that these are going to be super powerful, maybe even overpowered, versions of some of the spells that we're familiar with. Like, I think the Monstrous Regiment spell, isn't that kind of like Pan's Impenetrable Pelt? And then Storm of Renewal seems like maybe Regrowth or something, with an area of effect, an increased area of effect maybe. So anyway, those are two very interesting things. And they're not things that will last the whole battle. It sounds like these are buffs that last only during the period of ascendancy. So that'll be interesting to figure out, is there any way to manipulate that as a typical army? Or are you just sort of waiting for your time to shine? Curious, very curious. Then the Lore of Death. All units gain armor-piercing melee damage. That's something very important for death armies. And of course, we don't know what they have planned for death armies in Warhammer 3 yet. Some people have hypothesized that we may see Nagash, which I think would be awesome. We also might see some of the other units from the end times that didn't make it in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2. And possibly with some balance changes, we might see more armor-piercing damage come from these armies. But as it stands today, having that as a Cataclysm bonus, all units gain armor-piercing melee damage, that's a big buff to them. Their spell, Ashes and Dust, says a suffocating dust cloud chokes the life from enemies in a wide area after a short windup. Now, it doesn't say what effect that has. I could see that both being a debuff and a direct damage spell. Maybe even a vortex spell. But it doesn't say. So that's something that we'll just have to speculate over. Next, the Lore of Fire. All units get bonus melee attack. And if Warhammer 3 is anything like Warhammer 2, there's just so many ways to boost the melee attacks of your armies that this Lore of Fire Cataclysm bonus, in my opinion, it just doesn't seem as novel or as interesting as the others. Their spell, Magma Storm, sounds again like the sort of spell that we might already see in the Lore of Fire. So I'm assuming it must just be a supercharged version of it, or maybe a longer lasting version of it, maybe a broader area of effect. Anyway, so that's Lore of Fire. That's, in my opinion, that's kind of anticlimactic there. But we have the Lore of Heavens now. Now, I could totally see this being something that fits in very well with the High Elf build or a Dark Elf build, but the Dark Elves don't get access to the Lore of Heavens, so we're looking at maybe the Lizardmen. You've got the Empire with Lore of Heavens. You have the High Elves with the Lore of Heavens, or maybe some others that I'm forgetting. But in those cases, all of their missile units deal extra damage and have extra AP damage. Again, that's a great buff. That's a great buff for all those missile units. I could see that being extremely overpowered, especially if the Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 races, if they continue to have the sort of rosters that they have, like the Sisters of Avalorn and Lothern Seaguard, I can really see that being extremely broken. Their Cataclysm spell, Thorson's Thunderstorm, again, a great storm develops above the battlefield, annihilating an area with lightning bolts. Sounds like something that we might see either with the Lizardmen and some of their spectacular magic abilities, or just the description there sort of reminds me of that one spell from the lore. I think it's the Lore of the Deep with the zombie pirates, vampires. So it seems like something we may have seen before, but with just a larger emphasis, a bigger area of effect, maybe more power. Looks like most of these spells are that same way, but we'll keep going. The Lore of Light. All units gain magical attacks and immunity to psychology. That's very good. That's very, very good. Time Amok is their Cataclysm spell. The flow of time is altered over a portion of the battlefield, improving allies' reload skill, speed, and melee attack. Yep, again, similar to what we've seen before. Lore of Metal. All units receive bonus armor and missile resistance. That's nice, but I think very situational. Cataclysm spell is Gehenna's Golden Globe. A great molten sphere emerges from the earth and rolls across enemy forces. So, super upgraded version of Gehenna's Golden Hounds. Finally, Lore of Shadow. All units get faster charge and movement speed. The Cataclysm spell is Dance of Despair. A haunting tune envelops enemies in an area, reducing their leadership, melee defense, and melee attack. So, there's some other small details that I didn't really pull out from this blog article. But overall, I think what we're seeing is that Magic doesn't just play a equally prominent role in Warhammer 3 as it has in Warhammer's past. It appears as if the role has been increased and expanded. This is something that I find personally very exciting because I'm a big fan of the Magic aspect of the game. Now, today they released a blog on the new spells of Warhammer 3, the new spell lores. So there has the Lore of Tzeentch, Slaanesh, Nurgle, Lore of Yin, Lore of Yang, Lore of Ice, and Lore of Tempest. So again, I don't want to go through each of these because I think we'd be sort of exhausting the topic. But when I was looking at these, I was curious to see how much I felt they reflected the lore and the aesthetics, the themes behind each of the new factions. I feel like the Chaos lores, they really hit on the head. Some of these, I think, are going to be very powerful. And there's a few things that somewhat surprised me. So this Lore of Tzeentch, I was looking for, alright, what's the balance of damage to buffs and debuffs? And I was just thinking in my own mind, when thinking about what we would be doing with a Tzeentch army with a Tzeentch lore, I was thinking there'd be a lot more buffs and debuffs. But when I look at what they've produced, I'm seeing a lot of damage spells. There's one spell in particular that really stood out, and that was Glean Magic. Okay, so in Glean Magic, you basically steal Winds of Magic from your opponent's reserves and add it to your own. Now, based on some of the other things that Creative Assembly has discussed concerning Tzeentch, it seems likely that this faction will have numerous ways of manipulating the winds, so that you're always granting yourself the best bonuses and denying your enemy the best bonuses in terms of magic. So I'm really interested to see how that spell works. I think that could really be very powerful in the campaign, especially. Infernal Gateway looks really neat. Tzeentch's Firestorm, that looks interesting too. All of these spells that I would use when I look at the lore of Tzeentch. Again, if you're interested in reading all of them and looking at the details, I'll leave a link in the video description that you can follow yourself. But all of these spells would be spells that I would find useful. So I rate the lore of Tzeentch a 10 out of 10. I love it. Now, the lore of Slaanesh. This was interesting. I've always been curious how Creative Assembly is going to handle Slaanesh. It's probably the most not safe for work and not kid-friendly factions in all of Warhammer. It's the one exception that people are always able to bring to the table when they discuss how Warhammer is meant for children. Because you look at this, it's all about pleasure, it's all about excess. There's a lot of scantily clad models used on the tabletop for the different units of Slaanesh. So I was curious how Creative Assembly is going to handle them, and it's notable that they have yet to really show us anything from Slaanesh. I assumed, based on how they handled the Cult of Pleasure for the Dark Elves, that they would stay true to Games Workshop's vision for Slaanesh, and so I think I'm going to feel pretty okay with how the lore and how the aesthetic of the Slaanesh models and units will be. But looking at their spells, the one that I find very interesting is Slicing Shards. I'm a big sucker for both bombardment spells and vortex spells. I think they have some of the coolest looks to them. I think looking at the Slicing Shards, it says a mirror forms in the sky and it breaks. And once the mirror breaks, the shards of glass fall and they explode and lacerate the enemy. I think that's such a neat spell. When I read these, I'm thinking they're going to have some of the best visuals. Really excited to see how they play out in the battlefield. I know the spell isn't great, but Fiery Convocation in the high magic lore right now, one of my favorite spells, just because of the visual of a phoenix coming out of the ground and then just sweeping fire over everything in its path. That's such a cool visual, and I think the lore of Slaanesh is going to bring a lot of that to the table too. Lore of Nurgle. Now, if you've watched my last Warhammer video, you know I'm a sucker for the gross, stinky boys. This is it's my favorite faction in both Warhammer Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, and I'm a huge Death Guard fan for Warhammer 40,000. I collect all three of those armies. Everything about them, the aesthetic, the rules, how they play on the tabletop. I've always loved Nurgle, so I'm extremely excited to play with Nurgle. In fact, it'll probably be my first faction that I play through when Warhammer 3 launches, will be a Nurgle campaign. But looking at the lore of Nurgle, to be honest, I think it's because my expectations were too high, but I was a little disappointed. Some of these spells seem interesting, but none of them really hit me with that visual, that real visual attachment I have to the spells in Warhammer. There's a couple that are interesting, of course. You've got Rancid Visitations. It says the enemy is gifted the Plague Lord's nightmarish necrosis, causing their skin to blacken and their internal organs to mulch. Pours filth over an enemy, dealing damage all the while. Well, that sounds interesting. But I think probably the best spell here is Fleshy Abundance. That's a pretty decent spell on the tabletop and special ability too. But essentially it's like a regeneration ability. So, even though Nurgle is my favorite, I think I'm going to rate this lore a little lower. I hope to see something a little bit more spectacular for them. So I give this a 7 out of 10. 10 out of 10 for Tzeentch to review. Lore of Slaanesh, probably a 9 out of 10. I really think that's pretty exciting. Spell lore and then lore of Nurgle. Give it a 7. And that's high. I should give it something lower, but I just love Nurgle too much. So, lore of Yin and Yang. Again, I'm not super excited about this faction, and I'm not sure what it is. I've just never really been into this ancient Chinese and these different cultural milieus that they've used to inspire this new faction with. But looking at these, I think they will provide a lot of really interesting tricks, especially Yin. They've got a Hex spell, a Hiding spell, a Wind spell, a Vortex spell, and a Summon Unit spell. I think magic for them is going to be less about that direct damage and more about using it to manipulate the situation on the battlefield. So that's an interesting strategic dimension. So when I will obviously play through with all the new factions, and that's been my commitment with Warhammer 1 and 2. I've played a campaign on very hard or legendary with every faction. So I will continue to do that in Warhammer 3. But just completely being honest, nothing here really interested me. And the same thing with the lore of Yang. This was, albeit a little more interesting, because there was explosion and an interesting wind and an interesting breath spell. This ward save spell I think will be really nice. If I had to choose one from Cathay, one lore that I'd prefer, it would be Yang over Yin. I bet most people will have a preference. So take a look at these if you're really interested in Cathay. And then Kislev. Now, Kislev, both with Cathay and Kislev, there wasn't a ton of rules on the tabletop to really build these factions off of. So Creative Assembly working with Games Workshop now, I mean, just before I continue, if you haven't heard, Games Workshop is relaunching Warhammer Fantasy Battles, the regimental combat game with the square bases, all that stuff. They're relaunching it with a new title, calling it The Old World. So it seems to be, The Old World is to Warhammer Age of Sigmar that the Horus Heresy is to Warhammer 40,000. They're treating it like I don't want to call it a prequel, but a prior setting that has impacts on the latter setting. The Games Workshop has been developing new models, rules, and lore for Kislev, and I'm presuming now for Cathay, because they've built up, Creative Assembly has built these two factions, and they're like nothing I've seen, and they've talked repeatedly about how Games Workshop is involved in this. So I think what we're seeing here is not just a preview for the game, for the computer game, but a preview of what we could expect out of the old world. So looking at the lore of ice, is this Urson? Is this the god of ice, or is that the god of the storm? I can't remember. There's been so much at this point. I just need to start playing it to get my head wrapped around it more. A really interesting spell, something that I think I'm going to like to use a lot, just based on the description is Death Frost. Warriors shiver and shake in a wintry grasp until the piercing cold reaches their hearts, and finally they move no more. That seems really neat. But again, we're seeing an augment spell, another augment spell, breath, and a hex area spell. I don't think it's going to be an extremely powerful lore. What I've noticed in Warhammer is that the strongest lores of magic typically are direct damage or regeneration. And anyone that hexes and has breath attacks and things like that tend to not be so great. Obviously, an exception might be the lore of blood with the vampires. With Wind of Death, that's a wind spell that really packs a punch, right? But typically, the most powerful lores of magic, at least in my experience, are ones that have a lot of powerful vortex spells, powerful direct damage spells, and bombardment spells. Heart of Winter looks interesting. At one with the frozy plains and the snowy tundra of Kislev, wherever this one goes, they bring the icy heart of the motherland with them. Deals damage in an area and slows enemies, both values increasing over time as the storm gathers strength. So that's another one that I think is interesting. In fact, wait a second, that's Lord of the Tempest. Yeah, they don't have Heart of Winter. They're showing the casting of Ice Sheet there. Now down here, Lord of the Tempest, this is what casting Blizzard looks like. So I'm curious. Ooh, here's a Vortex. Oh, look at that. Hawks of Miska, that's another Vortex spell. Bombardment. Hey, sounds like my kind of lore of magic. Alright, so Blizzard is a Vortex spell. Snow and ice rise from the land, freezing and blinding any and all in their path with an unnatural cold. Large, damaging Vortex that also applies Frostbite. And the Overcast version deals extra damage. So that's what we're looking at. 3 damage per second, 100% armor piercing, and is that armor piercing? Looks like it. and that's magical damage. Also has speed minus 30%, large explosion area. Yeah, that looks pretty interesting. That's one I'll definitely use. So overall, I'd rate this one an 8 out of 10. This one I'd give a 5 out of 10. This one I'd give a 6 out of 10, a 4 out of 10, and then you already got my rankings for Lore of Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch. Now you might be wondering, why is there no Lore of Khorne? It's because Khorne hates magic, doesn't use it. Khorne has no spellcasters in their list, so you're not going to see one included here. Now looking at this also makes me wonder if these are all of the launch factions. If it's just Kislev, Cathay, and the 4 demon factions. That would make sense, but I know that there's a lot of people who are hoping to see some other things come for this game. But it's still early, and you know how Creative Assembly is. They're going to roll out dozens of DLC, which I'm sure will be expanding and adding new factions as we go on. I personally think we'll see Ogre Kingdoms, as a launch faction, and some people have suggested Chaos Dwarves. I don't think they're coming yet. I think they'll be probably an expansion race. That's one that they know people will pay for. But anyway, so this has been some blog review for Total War Warhammer 3. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. If you like the content we're producing, please subscribe. We make a few videos a week dealing with computer games, video games, and tabletop games, with a special focus on strategy games for the computer and on Warhammer Games Workshop titles for the tabletop. We also do Battletech. We'll talk Dungeons and Dragons as time goes on. If you like all that stuff, please subscribe and leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. Give us some feedback. It really helps us out a lot if you do all those things. Thanks. Until next time. See ya.